James Franklin and the other people who worked in the press, in the newspaper shop, had no doubt that this was a creation. They didn't think there was a person named Silence Dogood, but they never guessed it was someone who was working in their own shop as an apprentice. So he successfully fooled the people working there. They were impressed by the literary style of these letters, and they printed them.
This is an image of the actual Benjamin Franklin family house that used to stand right on that site. Just wanted to point that out. So Benjamin Franklin's family actually worshipped in this building, and they worshipped in the building that predates this one, the wooden building, the wooden meeting house that was right on this site, built in 1669, Fun fact, one of my favorite little tidbits is that when you look at a seating plan of that earlier meeting house that was here, the one that Benjamin Franklin was baptized in, the Benjamin Franklin's family pew that they rented out in the building was located right basically adjacent to the window that's right across the building from where their house was. So I just think that's a great kind of just evocative a way to kind of imagine that their family sat there all day for their church service, and at the same time basically must have really felt like it was an extension of their home, I would imagine, because they look out the window and their house is right there. The Franklin family pew in this building, if I am correct in my interpretation, I'm pretty sure it was more or less where that pillar is, not the very corner pillar, but the next one in. So where that box pew is today is approximately where the not Benjamin Franklin's, because by that time, this building was built in 1729, by that time Franklin had already moved away from Boston, so he would not have been attending here regularly, but his family, some of his family members would have still attended, and I believe that's where it was. So a little basis of why we talk about Benjamin Franklin here, his connection to us. And now I'm very pleased to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Robert Martello. Dr. Martello is a professor of the history of science and technology and the Associate Dean for Curriculum and Academic Programs at Olin College, a graduate of MIT's program in the History and Social Study Social Study of Science and Technology. He's the author of Midnight Ride, Industrial Dawn, Paul Revere, and the Growth of American Enterprise, a study of Revere's multifaceted career and national impacts. He's now researching Benjamin Franklin's printing and business endeavors, and he regularly lectures on Revere and Franklin for audiences of all ages and backgrounds. Dr. Martello's NSF-sponsored research, engineering education publications, and faculty development workshops explore connections between interdisciplinary education, student motivation, and self-directed project-based learning. He implements his findings in courses such as The Stuff of History, 6 Microbes That Changed the World, and Designing the 21st Century Engineer. And he's a member of the National Academy's Study Committee on the Integration of Education in STEM, Humanities, and Arts. Please join me in welcoming Rob Martello.
I was going to just simply point out that I love studying these American patriots that we all come to know and love for their services to our country. I love studying them for their other aspects of their career, such as their artisan work. Benjamin Franklin is such a wonderful example of that, having done so much in his life. I'm going to just cut right to the chase. There's so much that this person has done. I can't wait to get into it, and I just want to say how thrilling it is to be a historian researching Benjamin Franklin and be in a building like this that is so important to Benjamin Franklin. He was baptized here, for crying out loud. We're across the street from his house. So what a joy this is for me, and thank you all for joining me today. This is just going to be a lot of fun, just a special moment here. And let's dive in. So I'm calling my talk Benjamin Franklin Writer. We're going to see why in a little bit. I would like to start at the beginning of his life. Because when I say Benjamin Franklin, we think of him for so many achievements. There's just so much we can do. You have to realize how hard it is to summarize his life in such a short amount of time, or to just take one angle on it for someone who is just so accomplished, who did so much for American history. So when I talk about Benjamin Franklin, you might think of him as an inventor of bifocals, the Franklin stove, the glass harmonica. This interesting contraption here is actually an odometer, which he used when he was working in the post office to measure distances. You might think of Benjamin Franklin as a scientist. Most of his work was done with lightning. He actually also developed the lightning rod, but he did other things such as study the Gulf Stream and look at currents and how that might affect navigation. So this is an inventor. This is a scientist. He's also a diplomat. He spent a large portion of his life in Europe. He lived in England at one point, in France at one point, and represented either the colonies or the early United States of America in different negotiations. Extremely important work there. A statesman as well. He was actually involved in the writing of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and he was also an elected officer for Pennsylvania. So again, so much work that he did as an elected official or as a writer of documents. Finally, he's a philanthropist, the likes of which America has rarely, if ever, seen. So Benjamin Franklin either founded or co-founded institutions such as University of Pennsylvania, some of the first library, fire department, hospitals, right, all in Philadelphia. So again, this is somebody who was really thinking about public works his whole life. So I just went through very briefly so many achievements that he has, which is why I always like to start my talk by saying at the end of his life, when writing the last will and testament, it's a good time for someone to take stock of where they are and how they see their identity. Benjamin Franklin begins the last will and testament writing about himself saying, "I, Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia, printer." So of all the things I just mentioned, printer is what comes up. Now this, of course, is the master of representing oneself, right? Benjamin Franklin is saying that for a reason. He likes calling himself a printer for different reasons. But it is just important that of all the identities, this here, the man running the printing press, is what he is publicizing at the end of his life. So I'd like to talk today about Benjamin Franklin printing and how that makes him a writer, how printing made him a writer, how writing made him such an impactful person in American history. And I'd love to just sort of give you that overview, look at some of his writing experiences, his training in writing, what he did as a writer sort of before we think of him becoming famous. And let's see if that gives us some clues as to what Franklin does later on. And so in the introduction that I just received, it was done more beautifully than I could have done, just saying, I like to make a joke sometimes and say, Benjamin Franklin, we all think of him as a Philadelphian. Let me tell you, the city of Philadelphia really knows how to celebrate this man. There is a statue of him on every corner, based practically in that town. So here is where he was born, as we heard, right across the street from where this talk is being given right now. So how do we celebrate Benjamin Franklin, right? How do we celebrate his birthplace? I love this old image here. There used to be a Sir Speedy little photocopying, you might almost call it a print shop, right, was where it was located. As mentioned, this building is now darker, right, than it was when this photo was taken. I have to update my material. But it's not all bad, right? If we look at this building here, there's this section in the middle where if we just zoom in there, here's the correct color of the building. It says Birthplace of Franklin. So Boston does have ownership to the legacy of Benjamin Franklin. And as I'm going to say today, he did a lot of important things here in Boston that I think we should celebrate and be aware of in terms of how they set up the rest of his career. So born here in Boston, right across the street, January, right? He was one of 17 siblings. This is something that a lot of people don't realize. His father had 2 wives. So he was the 10th and final son of all of these children. He was always described as a precocious child. His sister describes him as reading the Bible as early as age 5. A bookish child, he was described as. His father used to say, I always thought that he would be my tithe to the church. As the 10th child, you're supposed to tithe 10% of your income. So his father used to joke and say, you will become a clergyman. But in fact, that didn't work out. That would involve a lot of schooling. It would be expensive. His father did not go through with that plan and said, after 2 years of school, let's find a trade for you. I'm speeding up here to just get to the good part of his writing. I'd love to talk more in more detail about what he did in early years, looking for a trade. But after a bit of a search, his father and Benjamin decided that printing would be a good calling for him. The quote here by Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography, he said, "This bookish inclination at length determined my father to make me a printer, though he already had one son of that profession." So Benjamin's older brother, James, was a printer, And his father said, okay, since you seem to like reading, you seem to be bored by some of the other trades, maybe you could be an apprentice to your older brother and learn that trade as well. And this ended up being one of the great boons, not just for Franklin, but I would argue for American history, as we're going to see. This was just an amazing choice of trade for someone like young Benjamin Franklin. So he began his apprenticeship at age 12. His brother decided on a 9-year term of apprenticeship, though he did not complete that term. And you could imagine when you're working for your older brother, there could be some sibling familial issues here. Having your older brother also be basically your teacher and your boss might not be the best situation in terms of family dynamics. I'm going to get to that briefly in a little bit. But working for his brother, he would learn all the different things that happen in a print shop, all the different activities that are going on. Printers are printing lots of items such as books, almanacs, smaller items such as brochures or pamphlets. So a lot of printing of different materials that are usually brought to the printer by others who wish just to have the printer print off copies and sell them, though occasionally the printer will decide on his own to decide on a print run, on his own investment, and get all of the profits from that. However, of all of the objects that printers did, newspapers were the prestige product. So when a printer is working on a newspaper, they are not merely reproducing the ideas of others, they are the generator of those ideas. So most print shops were trying to sponsor a newspaper if they could, though this was often easier said than done. James Franklin was one of 5 printers in the town of Boston, and he decided he would run a print shop. He would run in his print shop a newspaper. But he wasn't just any newspaperman. He was amazing. This is one of the sort of take-home messages I would like to have from this talk today. James Franklin often does not get the credit he deserves for what he did to American newspapers. So looking at Benjamin Franklin as an apprentice, learning at his brother's side, he got to get an experience working for a very special newspaper, the New England Courant. So to give a little context, the newspaper was started in 1721, and at this time, when we describe a newspaper in early America, it was actually pretty much a factual, often out-of-date factual, data dissemination with very little of the characteristic we give to modern-day journalism. Early newspapers would reprint news where they could get it. That often meant newspapers that had come from London or elsewhere, which might mean they were months or perhaps years out of date. So this could be local news for the town of London or for some other European location that has little or nothing to do with Boston, that is also months or years old. So you can imagine the locals finding that a diversion from the daily life, but not directly useful to them. Other things that would be put in newspapers of the day would be factual information about ship arrivals or departures, obituaries, reprints of acts of the local government, things that were simply factual, uncontestable, not particularly engaging for most of the readership. That's what a newspaper was. It was trying not to be controversial. James Franklin, in the words of one historian, created America's first real newspaper. The quote is, "the first literary, lively, entertaining, humorous, and proto-nationalistic American newspaper." By that we mean James was looking at his readership in Boston saying, what do they care about? There are some local issues here that matter. I'd like to really make those come to life and help people think about these issues. This was a paradigm shift. So this is the newspaper that really that moved the newspaper trade into a new position where people would be engaged with it. There might be controversy. It would be interesting. It would be fascinating. It might even be funny. It would be very relevant. The news would be more recent and more local. That was what James did. This is where Benjamin Franklin was learning the trade. So he was quite lucky that he entered at this time in this location. He got to see newspapers looking towards the future. So just a couple of thoughts about that, right? So things that appeared in some of the issues of the New England Courant would be questions about the debate over paper currency in Massachusetts. Is this a good or a bad idea? The smallpox inoculation controversy, extremely controversial, by the way. In a time when this was of unproven efficacy, people would wonder, do we want to inject our children with versions of a virus? Might we be doing more harm than good? So this is something where the clergy were weighing in. There were strong views on both sides. The New England Courant dove right into the controversy, started advocating for different positions. Printing election returns was something that was different. People would have a deep-seated care for that to understand not just who the new governors are, but how were they elected, who lost the election, how close was it, and so on. And also things that were not directly news-related, poetry, letters, historical pieces, again, a little bit more local than they were before, and humorous letters written by people with facetious pen names to just sort of be more entertaining and engaging. So a typical issue of the New England Current would have some of these types of issues in it, and you can imagine the readership was interested in this take on the print. So let's get back to Benjamin Franklin. So imagine him in this shop, having people writing articles in this new way. What was Ben learning here? What was he writing? So even at a very early age, he became a writer at a time when most young apprentices would simply be just operating the press or learning how to ink the type or doing something like that. So around the age of 13 or so, he wrote and then sold on the streets 2 broadside poems. One is called The Lighthouse Tragedy, and the other one was about Blackbeard the Pirate. These are dramatic descriptions of 2 very popular news items in the day. One was about a family, a father and some daughters, who died in an accident. They operated a lighthouse, but they died in the water. Their rowboat sank. And a story about piracy, about Blackbeard. James asked Ben, when he was age 13, to write up some poems describing these items when they were pressing in the news. They were like the hot news of the day. People were interested. So he said, this is a business opportunity. People might want to buy a nice poem about this. Could you please write it and then go on the street corner and sell some copies of it? And so Ben did that, and he sold a number of copies, although looking back on his autobiography upon this, he said, my writings were wretched stuff, right? So he looked back and said, this was not what we would call quality poetry here. But however, you could imagine him feeling the thrill of being a published author, seeing his writing have an impact at this extremely young age. He describes also in his autobiography, which was now a famous program that he took to improve his writing. He used a literary magazine called The Spectator that was published in London by this author who would take these very literary, well-described positions on topics of the day. And young Ben Franklin, in the evenings, often by candlelight, would take apart these essays in every sense of the word. He would physically cut them apart. He would also deconstruct them in a literary sense to see what makes these persuasive. What is a good mode of argumentation? What voice is being used? And then Ben would actually try from memory to reproduce and even improve upon some of these essays that were published in The Spectator. He did this over the course of months and years, really trying to improve his writing. So we're seeing he takes a methodical, meticulous approach towards writing. One other point I want to make is, I mentioned before how lucky he was to be working at a printer's office. Not only did he get a chance to write, he also had an exposure to books that would be almost unrivaled for someone of his class at this time. Remember, libraries were not a common thing. They did not really exist, to be honest, until Benjamin Franklin and others founded some of them in Philadelphia years later. So at this point, if you wanted books, you needed to own them or be friends with someone who owned them. And as a newspaper office, the newspaper owned a number of books that they used for references or maybe to even reprint. And furthermore, other books would pass through their hands because people would ask the print shop to print them, right, to reproduce them and print them off. So Ben had access to a number of books and got to read different ideas, different styles of communication, and he described later how formative this was for him to be able to read it. So we're seeing an amazing education here in this practical form of writing for a newspaper, being exposed to other things. So Benjamin Franklin took matters into his own hands at age 16. He wanted to be an author again. By this point, his brother was kind of keeping a tighter watch on him, saying, no, Ben, you're my apprentice. You should not be writing things. You should be running the press. So as I mentioned, he said, well, I think I could be a writer. Let's see what I could do. So he took on a pen name, his first of many throughout his life. This was a woman that he created, so a fictional creation called Silence Do Good, right, who he created as a widowed woman, right, who was middle-aged. Her husband passed away. She had children, who apparently decided to start writing letters to the newspaper. James Franklin and the other people who worked in the press, in the newspaper shop, had no doubt that this was a creation. They didn't think there was a person named Silence Do Good, but they never guessed it was someone who was working in their own shop as an apprentice. So he successfully fooled the people working there. They were impressed by the literary style of these letters, and they printed them. So he wrote a total of 14 letters. So they were printed about once a month-ish, a little more frequent than that. The first 2 of these letters offered a fictional life story of this creation. She described, how she became a widower and raising her children and what it was like to live where she did. And then the remaining letters gave her opinions on different issues of the day. So you could imagine Ben having the time of his life, pulling one over on the other people who work in his shop, seeing his work in print and receiving some acclaim, and also getting to play around, getting to voice his position on issues and really experience being a writer. After a while, he confessed, right? He decided this was getting a little too much, so he explained to his brother and others, yes, I am silence do good. And most of the people in the shop said, well done, Ben, this was extremely well written. His brother was not impressed or amused whatsoever by this. So this was the beginning of the end for his stay in Boston here. But for Ben, you could imagine how shaping this was. And again, what an opportunity it was for him to take a personal hand, right, and influence public opinion and so on. So very briefly, Ben described that he and his brother's disagreements came to blows at different points. They just found it very hard to work together. I'm really summarizing a fascinating story here because I'm trying to get to other writing issues that he had here. So at age 17, Ben Franklin ran away. He had to sell some of his own books, which were by far his most precious possession at the time. He used the proceeds from that to fund a trip down to Philadelphia, where he was trying to get work. He actually stopped. He was hoping to find work in New York City. He couldn't find work there, so he continued south down to Philadelphia. And this was a town, this was, by the way, a very famous arrival in Philadelphia because of his own description of his arrival in his autobiography. He described purchasing some rolls of bread, having them in his pockets, and walking through the streets, being seen by his future wife, right, who was not impressed with the way this raggedy young man looked, having bread hanging out of his pockets. So it's a very funny, humorous description of his arrival in Philadelphia in his usual self-effacing way. But when he got there, he was looking for work as a printer. He lied about his status because as an escaped apprentice, he should not have been employed. He should not have been employable, for that matter, right? He broke the law by leaving his brother's print shop before he finished his term of service there. But he lied and said that he had finished and he was a journeyman and he was suitable for hire. And he succeeded in finding work. So the story here gets so crazy that I'm afraid I don't have time to tell it during this talk. You're welcome to ask me during the question and answers. It's one of these cases where truth is stranger than fiction. He finds himself going to London after a short time of working in Philadelphia, and he's sort of stranded in London for 18 months, but he works in print shops in London. A zany story. I'm happy to go into more detail later. But long story short, after this convoluted experience, he returns to Philadelphia. After working for a merchant for a little bit, working as a clerk, he returns to the newspaper trade, actually for one of the people he worked for before this whole crazy detour to London took place. And in 1728, he finally is able to stop working for others and own his own print shop and run things in his own name. So were this a movie, this would be the heroic moment in the movie where he says, finally, you know, I've been working for others, I've been thinking about how I might improve things. Now it's me. Now I could do things the way I've always known they should be done. So he starts a print shop in 1728, and within a year, he manages to start his own newspaper. So the prestige product, he could say, now I could be an author again and get my ideas out there into Philadelphia. I also mentioned, though, shortly around this time, he is beginning a common law marriage to his wife at this point. So he starts his own newspaper, calling it the Pennsylvania Gazette at this time. And this is Benjamin Franklin's chance to say, this is what I believe newspapers should be. I've worked with my brother. I've seen the other newspapers here in the town of Philadelphia. I think that there's a way to do this that would really get a good readership and do some good, make an impact on all of this. So there were 3 writers at the time doing newspapers. He was by far the best writer of the 3 by any standard we might apply at this point. He actually quickly, he became a newspaper publisher by putting one of the other 2 out of business. So this is another one of those funny stories where when he started there were 2 newspapers and he wrote anonymous letters under a pen name in one of the newspapers complaining about the author of the other. That helped drive one of them out of business. He then entered the trade and became a very good writer himself. So it just shows you, right, how persuasive he's able to be. So now running his own newspaper, he went back to the common practice. He said, let's come up with a few new pen names here so that I could have some different voices I could play with and express different ideas. And I thought you might be interested in hearing. So, for example, there's Anthony Afterwit, the very simple and practical man. So you can imagine that voice being used to express certain ideas. Celia Single is someone who's complaining about men and their errant ways, and she could voice different things. And then I love Alice Addertongue, a young girl of about 35, right? You know, so that's someone who will often have these like humorous observations, you know, maybe at this character's own expense. So he's experimenting with different pen names, again, like as he did with Silence Do Good, maybe a little less rigorously, he's adopting more of them. But for the most part, as the owner and the person whose name is above the masthead of this newspaper, Benjamin Franklin here takes a more mature approach to the newspaper trade. So there might be an occasional humorous letter or something like that, but by and large, most of the articles here are being written by Ben Franklin not to be controversial, but to be engaging and popular and helpful. So he's trying to be informative. One of his famous pieces at this time is a piece called An Apology for Printers. This was something where he was at an early point not joking around this time, but saying, everyone, you need to understand what it's like to be a printer. It's my responsibility to portray both sides of an issue, and all of you out there may not agree with what I'm saying. You can't blame me for doing that. It's my job to inform you of all different positions so that you could then make up your own mind. So he's not only saying, don't shoot the messenger, but he's also sending a message, we should be broad-minded, we should listen, even if you have a position here, we should listen to both sides, and then you can form your opinion. It's my job to inform you, to educate you, to bring you up to speed. You can imagine that he feels a need to write this because at that time the newspaper writer was seen as responsible for what's in there. So if someone says, you're taking a position I don't like, they might show up very angry at his press, at his shop. So he is right here trying to bring about a change in the way society receives this, saying, let's not get angry at each other. Let's learn and read and let's have a conversation. So it was a very often reprinted piece that had quite an impact. As I said, a lot of his positions here were moderated, were popular, were measured. He was not trying to stir the pot or to rabble-rouse. He was really just trying to say, let me inform you. So this is a more mature person than the younger person who was enjoying just sort of like zinging as big brother and just taking on a persona like Silence Do Good. But when he had something controversial to say, he would trot out a new pen name and have that person voice it. So he didn't mind saying things. He would just be careful about doing it in a way that kept people listening and engaged to his newspaper. So we're seeing a change here in Ben Franklin. Even though this is the mature Ben Franklin, as I described him, he's about 23 and 24 around this time. So think of all the life he's led up to this point. It's just amazing, the amount of work he's written and the different places he's lived, Boston, Philadelphia, London for a little while. So we're seeing the makings of a very worldly writer here at this point in his career. Okay, so Benjamin Franklin is running a print shop. He is printing books and selling those. He is writing articles in his newspaper and disseminating those. At this point, he is getting good at writing, at taking on different personas and pen names and so on. So he said, is there a different product I could use? He's always looking for revenue, but he's also looking for influence. Is there something else I could do to expand my reach? And so many of us, when we think of Ben Franklin's writings, seize upon this most successful of all of his pen names, Poor Richard, because he decided it's time for me to enter the Almanac business. And I think I'm going to do that in a way to change almanacs the way my brother changed newspapers a little bit. Maybe not quite as radical, but he was trying to say, let's make the almanac something fun and useful, engaging, maybe a subversive way of getting some information out there for people who are usually reading it to learn about the weather and practical things. So Franklin took a new approach to Almanac. So he created a character, Richard Saunders, right, who is a farmer, right, a very entertaining person who has a wife, Bridget, who is always scolding him and kind of getting the best of him in little exchanges. And Richard is complaining about this man named Ben Franklin, who is the printer. So this is hilarious, where Benjamin Franklin has basically created a character who is saying, this printer, Ben Franklin, he's charging me too much for my almanac. I can't believe this guy. So it just adds that much more veracity, just that much more believability, right, to this character, right, that he's having the character attack himself. So it's very funny, right? So when you look at the Almanac, it says by Richard Saunders. So this was seen really as a believable person, right? Again, complaining about his wife nagging him, complaining about his printer overcharging him, but yet still trying to give this folksy wisdom and give his information out to the people. So it was a master stroke in terms of framing this publication here. It was very successful, right? So even the first edition that he did, he had to run off different print editions because they were selling so much. So he had a hit on his hands. In his own words, he endeavored to make it both entertaining and useful. I'm just flagging that as a key to Franklin throughout his life in a nutshell. That phrase is very useful to us here. So he doesn't want this to be in the slightest bit controversial. Let's make it funny. Let's have folksy sayings, wit and wisdom. But at the same time, let's sneak in there some helpful information. Now, some of the information is not being snuck in there. He has information about the tides, about the astronomical projections, about the calendar. That's something that was common to all almanacs. But he also tried to put in there some reasonable advice for people, a little bit of moral advice, some sayings, some charts of information for calculating things like interest rates. This is Franklin's way of saying, what would I want to know if I were someone out there, if I were a farmer or a reader of this almanac who would like to improve themselves? What kind of information can I put in front of them? And can I do it in an engaging way so it doesn't feel like a boring lecture? And I hope that's not what this talk feels like, by the way, right? But can I do it in an engaging way that makes you want to read more? So he took this on. So I mentioned here, calendar, weather forecasts. There'd be hymns, there'd be some recipes in there, news about local events, medicinal cures, occasionally some fun trivia, right? And we all know when we think of Poor Richard, you think of these famous sayings that Benjamin Franklin had. To be fair, to be honest, these Proverbs were usually not ones that Benjamin Franklin invented. He had books of Proverbs. There were many other sources that he did. However, he meticulously rewrote them. He would work hard to condense them, to make them as brief and witty and memorable as possible. So this is important to give credit where credit is due. So we should say he did not invent the sentiments behind these ideas. Some of them actually are biblical in their origins, but he did find a way to say them that made them memorable, sort of like one of those memes that we have today where you might imagine yourself repeating it to others. So I can't resist. I have to just share a few of them with you. It wouldn't be a Ben Franklin talk without things like 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Right? Today is yesterday's pupil. That's kind of a touching one. Clean your finger before you point at my spots. Genius without education is like silver in the mine. So we're seeing a little of Franklin here, right? A little bit of the ideas that he has. The worst wheel of the cart makes the most noise. And how about fish and visitors stink in 3 days? Right? There's some good advice here if you think about it. So, but again, this is what we think of Poor Richard says, right, and some of these things. Ben Franklin would release these each year in the Almanac. He then made a compilation of them after when he was leaving the Almanac business, and that sold very well too. People were saying, look, we love this part of the Almanac. We just have like a deep dive into a bunch of these here. So he really got a lot of mileage out of this. And I would point out, being a newspaper writer is quite a training in a literary sense, right? We can compare him to someone like Alexander Hamilton or Madison, who could basically get a bottle of brandy and a few cigars, dip their pen in the inkwell, and start writing until they're out of things to say, right? Just like have this flowing tongue. Benjamin Franklin thinks of print as a block of text where you are building it literally letter by letter, fitting the page, saying what you need to say in the space that you have to do it, because you're going to be inking that and printing it off later. So we see throughout his life, Benjamin Franklin has a way of hitting the nail on the head, saying what he needs to say, hooking your attention. This is a newspaperman writing. There's something different there than the person used to standing at a podium speaking and speaking and speaking. So I just want to point out, you could just see where you could see in these sayings a little bit of the larger person. Now, what sometimes is seen as a tragedy is that Ben Franklin's success allowed him to move out of the newspaper business. Most people would not say that was a tragedy. As I started this talk, look at all the things he did in his life. He was wealthy enough as a newspaper and almanac publisher to be able to, quote, retire from the trade. What that meant is he took his name off of the newspaper, he handed it off to others to run, but he continued occasionally submitting something, right, as like a concerned citizen, something to be written up in his own newspapers, and more importantly, he continued making a profit off of his newspaper as the owner of the newspaper. But by seeming to retire from the newspaper trade, he was able to change his role in society by saying, I no longer have ink on my fingers. I am not running a newspaper anymore. I am retired. I am a man of leisure. I am going to begin conducting some scientific experiments, beginning philanthropic exercises. If you would like to elect me to an office, I'd be happy to serve the town. So when he left the trade, he was able to begin all those other parts of his career that I mentioned before. He was able to be seen by the rest of society as a learned man and sort of like a member of the higher classes. So I put retirement in quotes. At the young age of 42, he was wealthy enough and had a continuing stream of income to be able to move on to other things. Of course, his writing did not stop. So the lessons that he learned continued throughout his life. He would often be writing letters, right, expressing his opinions in other publications perhaps. He helped to write things such as the Declaration of Independence, although he was just one of the team writing that, and so many other things. The last piece of writing I want to talk about, though, at the end of his life, he wrote the most famous autobiography, apparently in all history, the Benjamin Franklin autobiography, in which he told his life story. And you can see again these lessons from all of his early writing experiences coming to the fore in this autobiography. So when you read the autobiography, it's hard not to picture a person sitting there in this sort of kindly, familial way, just rattling off some stories. He's very self-deprecating. He's beyond charming. He's wizardly in his charm in this autobiography. And occasionally he'll say things where he'll pursue a tangent. He'll start telling you about one thing, the story will switch and follow a tangent, and then he'll say, "Oh, look at me, I must be getting old. Sometimes my mind takes these trips and wanders, and I can't believe that I said that. Okay, let's come back now. What was I saying before?" And you almost forget, you wrote this and published it. You know, if you found yourself pursuing a tangent, you're welcome to just delete that and not say it, right? So you're just reading this. It's almost like he's speaking to you and his mind is wandering, but he's giving you exactly the message that he wants. It is a beautiful masterwork where he tells his story in a certain way that paints a picture of himself the way he wants to be remembered. So, just in conclusion, I just wanted to remind everyone of throughout his life, his impact through his writing and his literary work was through these different newspapers, both in Boston, the New England Current, being sort of the beginning of what we think of as newspapers here, and then later in Philadelphia when he could run his own newspaper. And we get to see the way he uses personas to bring a perspective to his writing. As an almanac writer, he makes the almanac something charming, something funny, right? But yet practically valuable. This is not just a series of jokes. This is something that he thinks will help people, right? And we're seeing in the autobiography, I love the word avuncular for Franklin, right? He's just taking this approach where he's saying, come, let's just chat a little bit. Let me tell you a few stories here. And he creates what some describe as his finest persona, the Benjamin Franklin that history remembers him for now, this kindly storyteller who can tease you with a twinkle in his eye and make fun of himself, but at the same time tells you about the great things he did and how important, his contributions were, where his history and America's history and some lessons all become intertwined and inseparable. So I like to stop here by just saying that, the things that I mentioned before, as by being a newspaper writer, by being a printer, we're seeing his writing is very special here. His tone is diplomatic, right? Is reasoned, is measured. He's aware as a newspaper writer, if I offend you, you stop buying my products. I need to keep you listening. I'm going to make sure that I tell you my things without driving you away. He also is aware of pragmatic aspects of writing as a newspaper writer. I mentioned before, brevity above all. How can I fit this? How can I write this and be clear, but be concise? And why am I doing this as a newspaper writer? What is my goal? What am I trying to achieve here? He is very focused on that. If he's telling you a joke, there's usually a moral lesson to it. It relates to the issue at hand in some way. He's not just filling space. Finally, I remember all the personas that he creates. He is one of the masters of empathy. He is aware of his audience, as any good writer would be, and he is able to say, how do I get you listening? How do we create an empathy here? Is it through a persona? Is it through the way I tell the story? This is what shaped his life. He became a masterful diplomat. Even some of his detractors, like John Adams, had to cite some of his coups, right, in the diplomatic field because of his ability to get the other people listening and eventually agreeing with some of his positions and find some compromise without backing anyone into a corner. So in a nutshell, when I started, I talked about all the things Ben Franklin did, inventing and statesmanship and so on. And I believe we could look to his writing for clues as to how that all happened, why he made the impact he did. So why don't I just stop there and maybe take some questions? And let me thank you very much. Thank you, you're great listeners. So the question is, who did the research for Benjamin Franklin during the Almanac? That's very interesting. The research, the quote, research came from different places. He had a hard time delegating, to be honest. So a lot of the research into written materials that he might include, he would often try to do himself. He loved reading. So if he could have an excuse to do some more reading, he would do that. He was very knowledgeable compared to others. So he had less people working for him and more a network of colleagues exchanging information, flagging information, and things like that. A little bit later on, right? So it's hard to answer that question because he wrote almanacs over a stretch of time. Throughout Franklin's career, I just mentioned the word network, he built a network of other printers. They often were his apprentices, right? When they graduated, Franklin said, instead of seeing you as competition, can I loan you some money and get you started, and we can help one another? You can give me some of your profits, I can loan you some capital, but we can give each other information. If you go to one town and I go to one town, we can write local stories for each other. So some of his information came from this network of people. Now, the research, though, of an almanac also has some things like astronomical research. So tables of tides and dates and eclipses and things like that. Most almanac writers would sort of like they would pay someone else to do all of the writing and compilation. Ben Franklin found people to give him basically the numbers much more cheaply, and then he would kind of do the final massaging of this. So he did have some people helping him with the more data-driven parts of that, but it was less of him being, like a delegator and just more of him contracting it out, right, and just paying for some information like that.
How old was Franklin when he wrote his autobiography, and how long did he live after it was published?
Okay, the autobiography. And so when did he start writing it, and how long did he live after it was published? Trickier question than it might sound to answer, because he wrote that in stages. So he wrote different parts of it at different times in his life. Some of it when he was overseas, about the early parts of his life, some of it later on in life. So I am trying to, you sort of stumped me on that question because of the breadth of it. He wrote it in 3 major sections, and it actually was not, and so the first section was seemingly written to one of his children, right, saying, let me tell you a little bit about your father's life. Let me just, so it was sort of like that. Now, of course, he always intended it for wider publication, but that was more about the family history and pieces of information such as that. So he wrote that fairly early. I want to say he was in England, but please don't quote me on that because I'm a little rusty on the autobiography chronology. He wrote some of it while traveling on these long transatlantic ship rides. He was able to just recollect. And then he wrote some of it back in Philadelphia later on. I don't think it was actually public. I don't think he saw it in print. So I think, and I know for certain he did not finish it the way he wanted it to. He did a lot of editing on it, though, which is fascinating. So again, it makes it funny when you read the autobiography. It sometimes sounds like a rough first draft, like he's writing it and saying, I can't believe I just told you that. That wasn't what I meant to say. Look at my mind wandering. And in fact, when you look at, there's some of the copies of his autobiography show the detailed annotations that he made, where every anecdote, every piece of it was carefully planned and meticulously edited. He actually would make a double-sized page so that he would have half the page of his text and half the page of his edits to his text. So I'm just trying to point out that this thing was something that he just kept on polishing and revising, right, and revising and revising. And then the publication, therefore, was this sort of halting piece. One last anecdote about the autobiography is he mentions that when the British were in Philadelphia, right, during the Revolutionary War, they occupied his house at one point. Some of his papers were taken. And so he complained later, some of the detailed information I would like to have put in this was removed, was destroyed or lost or something. So he later said, I wish I could be more specific about some of this information. Again, this is the wizard writing. This is Benjamin Franklin. Is that true? Right, did he have it? Was there a specific document he's referring to that remembered that was lost? Could be, absolutely. Is this a general way to make a point about the occupation and the dangers of destroying property and maybe excuse himself for generalizing? That could be true too. No one will know. So there's many sort of like caveats like that about the autobiography, which makes it such a fascinating, document, like a living document. But I'm being a little bit vague about the dates because I'm not quite fresh on that. I'm studying more in my research the earlier parts of his writing, I'm afraid. So you caught me on an area where I'm just generalizing a little bit there. So I apologize for not going into more detail there.
Maybe one
Time
more,
for any more?
Maybe one more question.
One more? I could be a little quicker maybe, right? And one more. And I could answer more questions at the end,
then,
perhaps.
yeah,
Yeah. So
anyone has-
was that a painting by what? I'm not sure of the source of that actually. That was right. A lot of this work was done after, right, his death, when the autobiography became. So I'm afraid. So you mean one of the ones of him with the bread, right, with the clothing and that kind of thing? I'm afraid I don't know the information of that.
And
I'm sorry.
how much older was his brother James than he was?
James was 9 years older than he was. And that's it. Yes, a funny story there is they fought bitterly when they were both in Boston, but they reconciled later. And Franklin actually took care of his brother's son at one point when his brother was getting close to passing away. Benjamin Franklin said, I'll set him up in a trade. I'll look after him. So they came back together again at the end.
And what's the difference between a diplomat and a statesman?
Oh, diplomat and statesman. I used those words in the beginning there. So there were when I say diplomat, I'm talking about Benjamin Franklin representing the interests of either a colony or colonies or the interests of America as a whole in a foreign court. So as a diplomat, at different points, he was, so earlier in his life, he was living in London, representing at first the colony of Philadelphia, and interestingly, other colonies said, hey, while you're there, could you represent us too? Where he would advocate for different issues, right? So he would lobby Parliament or do something else to try and work on behalf. Later on, he was living in Paris, and he was a diplomat on behalf of America during the writing of the peace treaty and things like that. He represented America in the court of France. So that's what I mean by that, versus statesman, when he would be living in America, working on writing a document or being the governor or something like that. So those were my uses of the terminology.
And was that a glass harmonium that he invented?
It's called the glass, yes, the glass harmonica, or armonica it's sometimes called. Yes, that is correct. Yes, sometimes there's a performance in Boston, right, where someone will bring one out.
We actually had Vera Myers, a local musician who plays the glass harmonica and has her own, and she was here, right here, playing just in December for our holiday open house. So, all right, well, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Applause.